Top 10 perfect old muscle cars for any budget. The American Motor Corporation, AMC, competed with the Big Three but was never really a threat to their dominance. They always offered lower-priced solid alternatives, and that was true in the classic muscle car era. Actually, in the early 1970s, no car company had more fun with muscle cars than AMC, and any list of the best old muscle cars has to include their original rides. A Javelin, Hornet, or AMX would be worthy, but nothing was as cool as the 1970 Rebel machine. Even the name sounds like an anti-establishment badass. As great as the AMC muscle cars were, it never occurred to them to pack a freakish amount of horsepower into any of them. The biggest engine they ever offered was a 390 Ci V8, which wasn't slow, but it was standing still next to a 440 or 454. The best place to start a list of the greatest old muscle cars is with the first one. While there had been models that fit the definition with powerful engines like the 1955 Chrysler C300 and the 1957 AMC Rambler Rebel, the 1964 Pontiac GTO is widely regarded as the first real muscle car. It certainly spurred imitators from all the other American automakers and kicked off the classic era. GM Heritage noted the GTO option package was the car that started the muscle car era, and they should know. The formula was quite simple. Take an intermediate car like the Le Mans and shove a big engine under the hood for an affordable performance ride. Pontiac's gamble paid off, and the GTO was so successful it became its own model, rather than a trim package. For the record, GTO stands for Gran Turismo Omologato, which roughly translated from Italian means homologated, qualified for competition, Grand Touring Car. Oldsmobile probably sold a lot of 442Z because people thought that was the engine displacement. In actuality, it stood for a 4-barrel carb, 4-speed manual transmission, and dual 2 exhaust. That doesn't mean it didn't have a humongous engine, because it did offer a 455 Ci V8 that made people think the world was coming to an end with its terrifying power. The 442 is technically the second muscle car of the classic era, because it was unleashed in 1964 as a response to the GTO. Easily the best of the run was the 1968 442 when it became its own model instead of just a performance package for the Cutlass. Motor Trend couldn't stop raving about the massive torque it produced by the 1968 455 engine because this was one of the most muscular muscle cars ever. Thinking of Chevy's muscles will bring up Camaros, Chevelles, or Novas. And on the Pontiac side, Firebirds and GTOs Dodge muscle cars as well as Plymouth Muscle will bring up too many fast rides to list. Ford muscle cars, however, don't immediately draw anything past a Mustang, but the Blue Oval was more than a one-trick pony. A 1970 Ford Torino Cobra is every bit as badass as anything from the classic muscle car era. It just kind of got overshadowed by the high-performance Mustangs. Realistically, the Torino was a popular model, and it offered great performance packages since its introduction in 1968. It was the 1970 Torino Cobra that got the 429 Ci V8, so it wins as the best version. Chevrolet came out with the Camaro in 1967 to compete directly with the Mustang, and while Ford was packing horsepower under their hoods, GM had an arbitrary rule that Chevy cars couldn't have engines larger than 400 cubic inches. The first-gen Camaros were certainly cool looking, but lacked the muscle of their competitors. That, however, doesn't mean they sucked, and the 1967 Camaro SS was certainly no slouch. Chevy actually understated the horsepower ratings on their engines for insurance purposes, because more ponies meant higher premiums. The 396 Ci V8 in the 1967 SS was rated at 375 horsepower, but anyone who ever got smoked by one would swear it was more. Those first-gen 396 were also torquey as hell, so they blasted off the line. Motor Trend called it an honest street car that is raced on the street. Plymouth Road Runner, introduced in 1968, was the working man's muscle car with no frills and tons of speed. Developed as a low-priced version of the upscale GTX, the Road Runner ended up being one of the most fearsome muscle cars of the classic era. The smallest engine available was the 383 Ci V8 because this was a car that was serious about blowing doors off. A 1969 Road Runner with the optional 426 Hemi engine was one of the cars you never wanted to line up against. Not only could it run a quarter mile in the low 13 SC, but it also had that cartoon meep meep horn that would mock you in defeat. At the time, its boxy lack of styling seemed stark in comparison to other flashier muscle cars, but in retrospect, it's the perfect design for a working class ass kicker. The first generation Dodge Charger was kind of bizarre looking and wasn't very successful, but when the second gen came, it was a car that literally defined the classic muscle car era. Lots of muscle cars look similar, like how Chevelles, Torinos, and 442s have the same basic body style, but nothing looks like a 1968 Charger. It was both muscularly aggressive and aerodynamically sleek. In a vintage test drive of a 1968 Hemi, car and driver called it the mark of excellence, with obvious appeal for the performance-minded enthusiast. The other thing about the second-gen Chargers is they were powerful and had no credible rivals when it came to pure speed. Its intimidating looks and quick response led to the Charger being cast as the villain car in classic movies like Bullet, Cannonball, and Death Proof. It also got a chance to be a good guy car in the Fast and Furious franchise, because movies about street racing need to have the best street machine Detroit ever cranked out. The second-gen Charger is the archetype classic era muscle car for which all others aspired. 1971 Plymouth Hemi Cuda. The Plymouth Barracuda is one of the most consequential muscle cars of the classic era. Though it was introduced in 1964, the same year as the first GTO, at that time it was kind of a weird-looking pony car wannabe with some unimpressive engine options. In the second generation it got faster and cooler, but by the third gen it realized its true potential and cemented its place as a legendary muscle car. The 1971 Hemi Cuda is simply the fastest factory classic muscle car era vehicle ever produced. It couldn't be beat in the quarter mile, and the only reason it ever lost a race was due to driver incompetence. It was also one of the coolest looking muscle cars based on the first gen Dodge Challenger, but with a lot more attitude. It would be #1 on this list if not for its iconic Mopar cousin, the Charger. The Chevy Camaro was a pony car, but the Chevelle was a straight-up bow-tie muscle car. It started out as a mid-size platform that could be a 4-door or even a station wagon, but eventually morphed into a powerful 2-door coupe. The first couple of generations were saddled by GM's no big engines policy, but that was lifted in 1970, and the Chevelle took advantage by getting itself a massive 454 Ci V8. The expressed purpose of the 1970 Chevelle 454 SS was to be a Mopar killer, and while it could hang with the 440S, it was still half a tick slower than the 426 Hemis. That didn't matter, because it was a killer ride, and the muscle car that Chevy should have been building all along. It had menacing looks and power under the hood to make it one of the best from the classic era. Despite the iconic status of the Ford Mustang in American automotive history and its reputation for speedy cars, it didn't begin life as a muscle car. Introduced in 1964 1/2, the fabled pony car was a fun, sporty ride, but didn't start flexing its muscle until 1967 when they began putting big block V8S under the hood. GT 350S and Mach 1S are undeniably awesome, but the king of Mustang muscle is the 1969 Boss 429. The unprecedented power of the semi-Hemi engine, combined with the aggressive looks of the fastback coupe, made the Boss 429 one of the greatest muscle cars ever. It was such a cool car that it got a starring role in the first John Wick movie and is really the catalyst for all events in the entire franchise. The weird thing is the car in John Wick is actually a Mach 1 pretending to be a Boss 429, but that's why it's called acting. So we have shared with you top 10 perfect old muscle cars for any budget. Hope they will be useful to you. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.